Oh, I'll have to stop the other screen share. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Is it working?
Yes, we can see it. I think I'll swap back now. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
I got it.
Hi, Megha. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Oh, my video is not on.
Okay, live streaming has been started, Megha.
Yeah, I'll be sharing the tweet and the LinkedIn post right now.
Sandeep, can you make me the host, please?
Yeah, doing that.
Bhakti, you can just WhatsApp me, okay? When you want me to see.
Sure.
I'm not able to see the chat window.
Sure, I'll do. So I've opened up the webinar for the participants to join.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Megha Pradhan, a Senior Policy and Training Manager at CLEAR and JPAL South Asia. Thank you so much for joining us today. This event is being organized by CLEAR and JPAL South Asia as part of the G-Local Evaluation Week, which is an annual global M&E knowledge sharing movement led by the Global Evaluation Initiative. The theme for this third edition is Building Forward Better. We are trying to explore how, through effective and robust monitoring and evaluation, we can better tackle crisis in the future. Today is the last day of the evaluation week, and we hope that you've been able to tune into some of these events, not just in South Asia, but also worldwide, given that all of these events are being conducted virtually. In South Asia, we've had a very exciting lineup of events in the last 1 week. We have 25 webinars organized by 20 partners across 6 countries. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of our partners as well as participants who've engaged in the Global Evaluation Week and really participated in making this a very lively exchange of M&E knowledge and practices. Before we proceed, I wanted to quickly introduce you to the organizers for today's webinar. Firstly, the Center for Learning on Evaluation and Results, or the CLEAR network. This network is coordinated by the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group, and we're a proud partner of the Global Evaluation Initiative. CLEAR aims to strengthen monitoring and evaluation systems and capacities and the use of evidence in the Global South. And the CLEAR South Asia Center is hosted by JPAL South Asia at IFMR. JPAL South Asia is the regional office of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, a global research center working to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. It's anchored by a network of over 200 affiliated professors across leading universities of the world, and they're united in the mission to conduct rigorous research through randomized evaluations. Now I will hand it over to Niharika, who's going to be the moderator for today's session. So over to you, Niharika.
Thanks a lot, Megha. Hello and welcome to all. I'm Niharika Betkerur. I'm a policy manager at JPAL South Asia and the moderator for today's session. We're really excited to present today's webinar at the GLocal Evaluation Week 2021 and support MLE knowledge sharing and evidence use. So today we will be discussing the use of phone surveys in various contexts to build stronger M&E systems and improve last mile delivery of public services. In the past year, there has been quite a pivot to phone surveys due to restrictions in field data collection for obvious reasons. So phone surveys have been used to understand the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns, and even in some cases, help governments direct resources for relief. But phone surveys can also have wider applications, even in regular program monitoring, and can be used to improve program implementation. So in today's webinar, we'll hear from researchers who will shed light on how they have used phone surveys to improve and guide last mile service delivery in both a pre-pandemic and pandemic setting. And they'll be drawing from their research with the Payments and Governance Research Program at JPAL South Asia. They'll also share their experience in addressing some of the operational and technical complexities of phone surveys, which we hope will be useful for the audience here. So a quick introduction to the Payments and Governance Research Program, which is hosted at JPAL South Asia. This team is led by development economists Karthik Muralidharan and Paul Niehaus at UCSD and Sandeep Suktankar at UVA. The team works very closely with central and state governments to evaluate major reforms to social programming using large-scale randomized evaluations. Over the past 5 years, they've worked extensively and evaluated reforms in the PDS, the NREGA, and pensions. And they continue to focus on improving DBT models and beneficiary-centric design of social programming. So I'd like to now introduce our speakers. Gaurav Chiplunkar is an assistant professor of business administration at the Darden School of Business, University of Virginia, as well as a JPAL invited researcher. His research examines the impact of labor market frictions and barriers on firms and workers. And he also studies the role of socio-political institutions in affecting these barriers and how policy reforms and new technologies may help mitigate them. He also works with the Payments and Governance Research Program on various projects where he is currently leading research on the use of phone surveys to improve last mile delivery of public services. Gaurav holds a PhD in economics from Yale University. Welcome, Gaurav, and it's really good to have you here. Our second speaker is Karthik Srivastava. He is a PhD candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he's pursuing research in development and labor economics and political economy. Before starting his PhD, he worked at JPAL South Asia with the Payments and Governance Research Program, and then at the World Bank in Washington, DC. Karthik holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Economics and Mechanical Engineering from Yale University. Welcome, Karthik, and it's a pleasure to have you here as well. So just a couple of housekeeping points before we begin. So in the first segment of this webinar, we'll hear from the speakers, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. We invite you to leave questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and the speakers will take them during the Q&A session. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Gaurav.
Wonderful. Thanks, Niharika. Let me share my screen. Great. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so thanks everyone for attending this talk, and Karthik and I are very excited to chat about what we have been thinking about on phone surveys. So, I mean, both of us are there. So if people have comments or questions that can be answered in the chat, feel free to, put them in the chat, and Karthik can take care of it while I'm talking, and then vice versa when Karthik is presenting. So just to start off with what the agenda for today is. So essentially, as we can see in the Indian context, but also more largely across developing countries, there are these seemingly contradictions about a booming economy with great institutions, and yet very chaotic conditions for service provision. And in the Indian context, that's very, very visible in certain sectors. And so you can see, for example, whether it's field agents of the state, policemen, engineers, teachers, health workers, so on and so forth, it's increasingly become difficult to understand for the state to understand their progress and to monitor them. And so one of the sort of innovations over the last decades or two has been the fact that cell phone penetration has increased manifold across most of these countries. So for example, in the Indian case, we had almost, for every 100 people, we had less than one cell phone in 2000, but now by 2019, it's almost 85 people out of 100 own at least one cell phone. And so really, along with some of these large government initiatives like JAM, so the Jan Dhan Aadhaar and mobile, there is a comprehensive push both by many of the state departments to really have a comprehensive beneficiary data list that then is connected to both cell phone and Aadhaar seeking. And so really where we see the value of HFM, or high frequency monitoring, as we are going to call them, using phone surveys, is that we have these large administrative data sets on these beneficiaries. We have a large mobile penetration in most parts of the country. And so can we really think about building a phone-based monitoring system for this last mile service delivery? That's essentially going to be what we are going to try and explore, both as a research agenda in the long run, but also for this talk. So the idea is going to be that visibility of at the last mile, so whether it's your policemen or whether it's your teachers, whether it's the Anganwadi workers, can we build a more comprehensive way in which we can actually generate feedback on programs that have been implemented? And so what I'm going to focus on in today's talk is essentially first to share our experience using these high frequency monitoring phone surveys in a couple of contexts that we've already tried out in Delhi and Telangana. And really what we would appreciate is to open up a discussion to think about other potential applications in the Indian context. So we have some ideas on where we think would be good applications, but of course I'd love to hear from the audience as well on some applications that would be useful. And so really, let me start by just, with this very 30,000 feet overview of what we are trying to do, get into the weeds of really what is lacking in the Indian context. So think about, on the one side, you have the government, and on the other side, you have beneficiaries. And there is some program that's, being implemented. So this could be, the public distribution system. This could be Manrega. This could be, midday meals. It could be any of these large-scale programs that the government has been implementing. And what we as the government, or we as the public sector, would want to evaluate is the inference on quality of the program, right? So is it running well? What are some of the issues that are coming in? Are people delivering the program with its highest quality? If there are constraints, if there are bottlenecks, what are they? And really the issue here is some of these are going to be time sensitive as well. So you want immediate feedback coming in from this. And so really, what can we say about the inference of the quality of the program? And that heavily depends, as you can imagine, on the measurement of this quality, right? Which is going to happen at the last mile. So take public distribution system, for example, right? So if you have wheat and rice, which are being given out to beneficiaries, are they actually getting their entitlements that for that month? And that's going to heavily depend on measuring that correctly. So how have things been happening off late, or in general? What are some of the standard ways in which measurement happens and inference happens? One is administrative data dashboards. And Manrega is a great example of this, right? They have excellent data through these dashboards, but most of it is collected either, through self-reported or administrative data that's reported from the ground itself. So, for PDS or Manrega, now you have EPOS, for example, which is electronic systems that are trying to do this. But earlier it used to be, you have a job card and how much the person work on the job card, and that's basically being aggregated up. So again, if that measurement is imprecise or incorrect, or if there are incentives within the system to misreport that, then your admin data dashboard is going to be a function of how good the data is at the last mile. What other things have people, what other systems do we see? For example, we also see grievance redressal systems, right? So for example, we see online or phone or physical visits, people can call up, there are helpline numbers, and you have grievance redressal systems. Or you have, these large scale detailed surveys. So think, like the national sample surveys or the census, the decadal census surveys. These are extremely detailed surveys, but they're infrequent in a way. And so really, what we want to, the take-home point over here is basically to say that measurement is really going to be critical for the effective monitoring of these programs, and especially where measurement is limited in the current context is really the last mile. So we have very good data and processes up to a certain point, but really at the last mile, many of these government programs are flying blind in a way. And so if you think about, some of the pros and cons of the existing systems that I just highlighted on the previous slide. So for administrative data, again, it's great for visualization, inference, and information, but it's entirely dependent on the quality at the last mile. Grievance redressal systems are great because they are precisely the people who are upset about the program or need assistance for the program. But at the same time, there are high costs or low perceived utility of calling. So if you have helpline numbers, you have no idea whether something's going to happen or not. You might have to visit, for example, a nearby center, which is, 10 kilometers away. And so even though there are grievance redressal systems, they have very low take-up. And obviously, it's not representative of the experience of the broader population. And large-scale surveys like the NSS and PLFS and so on and so forth, all of them basically are representative, are very detailed, but infrequent and very costly. And so really what we started thinking about was, a potentially better solution to all of this is why don't we just call beneficiaries and ask them what they think about it. And so today we're just going to talk about some of our learnings about using phone surveys at the last mile. So why would some of these phone surveys be important? One is that you could collect real-time data. So it's a phone call. And so if they can be done at regular high frequencies, it could actually generate a large sample of beneficiaries to get real-time data. Second, you could call people up over different, either geographic distributions or over time to really understand the implementation quality, both across space as well as across time. And lastly, which is important, some of the context we have worked with is that they're extremely flexible. So think about if you had the NSS and you were implementing the NSS and suddenly you figure out that, there is some questions or there are some modules which are not really working well, to adjust it is extremely costly. Whereas if it's a phone call, and if it's done at very high frequency, there is potentially more flexibility in the design as well as the cost effectiveness of adapting the survey to certain contexts or, with over time as different bottlenecks emerge from the implementations. And so really where we think HFM has, three broad categories where HFM might be useful. One is, policy decision making. So should we start a new program? Should we, continue an existing program? Should we make systematic changes? All of these questions, I think, you could just call up people and ask them about their opinion. So in a way, it's also democratizing this entire decision on policy making and, getting a first pulse of what people are thinking about if you were to implement this program. Second is, troubleshooting. So do we need to devote resources to fix certain problems? Is it over time? Is it in geographic regions? So on and so forth. Troubleshooting becomes kind of easier if you have, HFM modules. And then there is performance management, which is you not only do you get the beneficiary experience, but now what you have is, a measure of the quality of the program implementation. And so you could use that information to then either monitor or motivate your frontline workers to either, reduce these bottlenecks or, motivate them for better performance. And then you could come up with decision rules in terms of how to reward or punish these agents depending on the context. So for example, some of the case studies that we have tried, and then we'll jump into a couple of specific ones in Telangana and Delhi. But essentially, the framework that we are thinking about could be applied to generating high frequency dashboards, improving personal performance, recognizing and remedying exclusions. So the last point here is actually quite important in many contexts where you don't understand. So you can measure the quality. So for example, take PDS, right? If I have a ration card, I can, monitor how much ration you have been getting. But if you don't have a ration card to begin with, you're excluded from the system. And in a way, your admin dashboards, etc., are really not going to be able to capture those set of people. And to the extent that those excluded people have a cell phone, there is a way of contacting them. And so in a way, we could also engage beneficiaries to recognize and remedy exclusion patterns from these welfare programs. You could trigger implementation quality, popularity of proposed initiatives, so on and so. This is basically repeating myself, but essentially the point here is it has various contexts that we see there is a lot of merit to applying this to. And essentially what we want to figure out or talk about today is two specific case studies where we have really used HFM to highlight some of the learnings as well as the limitations of using high frequency monitoring. And then the last point, which is underappreciated but very important, if you want to evaluate a program or if you want to collect inference on program quality, is how cost effective is it as compared to other methods, and second, how scalable is it, right? So if I want a large program like the PDS, and if I want to evaluate the quality of PDS, for example, how scalable is the method of monitoring? So for example, if you take these outbound calls, phone calls have, the price of a phone call has, decreased by almost, I don't know, like 80 to 90% over the last decade. And so it's extremely cheap to make these phone calls. Because of technological systems that have improved over time as well, sharing reports and disseminating information to key stakeholders has become largely automated. And we'll give you some examples both in Telangana as well as in Delhi, where creating these dashboards and updating them real time is really not that difficult anymore. And so potentially such a method could give you extremely high returns given the large scale of a program. And so this could be both in terms of the quality as well as experience, as well as sharing it with different parts and different stakeholders. And so therefore could be applied to these large programs like PDS, Manrega, ICDS, so on and so forth. So why don't I hand it over to Karthik, who can talk about the example in Telangana. Karthik?
Yep, great. Thanks, Gaurav. So yeah, I'll go over one of the earliest use cases. And the setting here is Telangana's Raitu Bandhu scheme, which was launched by the government in May 2018. Gaurav, you'll have to toggle the slides because I don't have control. Yeah, great. So the background to the program essentially is that transfers of roughly 4,000 rupees per acre were made to farmers registered as landowners by the state. And this was per cropping cycles. And each transfer essentially was made in the form of ordered checks, which could have been exchanged for cash or into direct deposits at designated bank branches. The intention of the policymakers here was to encourage farmers to purchase agricultural inputs. So this is, as you can recognize, a pretty significant break from past policies, wherein agricultural subsidies tend to be distortionary in nature, and this was essentially an income supplement which the policymakers were intending to be used in a similar sort of spirit. And DBT has certainly become quite sort of mainstream recently, but this was one of the first big policies that the state government launched, dipping their toes into this broader sort of policy movement. And since then, we've seen similar policies taken up in Odisha and even at the central government level. The key agents from our point of view here were the Mandal agricultural officers. So the Mandal is essentially the sub-district level of government in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And these agents were essentially responsible for check distribution at the last mile. The key point here is that this was completely new and unfamiliar work. Certainly nobody had ever undertaken this sort of exercise in this context. And this was added to their existing set of responsibilities. So this was new work that they were doing on top of their other tasks. Right. This policy was certainly very high profile and had a key sort of political salience. So given the large budget, which was roughly around 12,000 crore rupees dispersed annually, which amounted to roughly 7% of the state budget. And also in terms of absolute number of beneficiaries, it covered the entire universe of landowning farmers in the state, which was just under 6 million farmers. Given the sort of pending elections, this had high media attention and political salience as well. Note that given the agents that we were talking about just now, the MAOs, the Mandal Agricultural Officers, there were the standard set of implementation challenges that accompany a scheme of this size. So on the first orders, there is the issue of non-creation or non-delivery of checks. The people who are intended to be beneficiaries but just get dropped out of the beneficiary net, if their checks are not printed, if there's some issues in their registration, etc., etc. There's also the problem of late delivery of checks, because the intention of the policymakers was to give this money to the farmers at a time such that it could be used to buy time-sensitive agricultural inputs. If the checks were delivered too late, that would essentially defeat the purpose and undercut the entire architecture surrounding the policy. And lastly, I think there is a standard concern of leakage along the distribution process. So given the hierarchical nature of these sort of transfers, you worry about leakage at any point of the distribution. So it could be at several points. It could be at the point of distribution or at the point of encashment. One sort of really helpful innovation that the state carried out right before the implementation of this policy was a massive exercise of land record digitization. When they did that, they also asked for beneficiary phone numbers. During this process, they eventually ended up codifying 62% of the database with beneficiary phone numbers, which was at the time an outlier in terms of administrative data sets with good quality phone number records. In the last 3 years, we've seen this practice elsewhere, and we're now in a world in which this is a pretty common practice. And increasingly, we see better and better digitization and phone integration across government programs. Right, so let me talk a little bit more about our actual study now. So this was led by Karthik Muralidharan, Paul Niehaus, and Sandeep Suktankar and Jeff Weaver, who are all part of the Payment and Governance Research Program. We contracted a private vendor through the government to call a random sample of farmers. So this private vendor essentially was a market research type entity, and they do customer surveys and consumer service type work for private entities. We sampled 150 per mandal, which is under 50,000 farmers in total, and ended with an eventual response rate of about 50% or so. The key point here was the speed at which the surveys were rolled out. Because the actual policy was time sensitive in nature, and we were heavily invested in giving real-time policy insights, we needed to complete a lot of surveys in a very short period of time and then feed those insights back into the policy-making process. All told, we did about 22,000 surveys in just under 2 weeks. And the surveys typically lasted around 5 minutes on average. In addition to the beneficiary surveys, we also spoke to a random sample of the MAOs, the Mandal Agricultural Officers. And this was actually really important eventually because this gave us some insight on process monitoring, but also told us sort of a more complete picture of program implementation at the last mile. So it's important to hear the side of the frontline workers themselves so you can understand their motivations and their sort of issues. The beneficiary surveys collected basic information given the short survey duration, but it was actually valuable enough to get a pretty complete picture of their beneficiary experience. So the indicators we collected information on covered whether and when farmers received their checks, whether and when they encashed their checks, any problems they encountered while receiving or encashing their checks, and their overall satisfaction with the program, which was just to sort of test their pulse and their feelings about the program overall. I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of randomization strategy, given that this is a JPAL event. I mean, the map on the right-hand side essentially shows the treatment and control allocation of the mandals, which was the unit of our the mandal agricultural officers, which were obviously the unit of our attention. We chose around 25% of the MAOs to be in the treatment group, and these people with their supervisors were informed of the fact that we will do surveys with beneficiaries in advance of the distribution of their checks. So this was done through a video conference and followed up with a letter with details that was signed by the state authority. So this is obviously sort of increased the salience of the data collection exercise in the minds of these frontline workers. In this video conference, we explained to them the data collection process and also informed to them that the reports that we generate using this data will be shared with the agents as well as their superiors. So they had some incentive or some information to improve their performance on the margin. The reports from this data were eventually sent to the treatment MAOs roughly 4 weeks after the calls were completed. So that's when we sort of tied the loop from beginning the evaluation to feeding results back to the last mile. Overall, this allowed us to compare the implementation quality in treatment and control areas. I mean, pretty standard sort of RCT setup. And obviously we did all of because we had process monitoring data, we were able to evaluate concerns on spillovers, et cetera, et cetera. I would not go into too much of the details on that design, et cetera, but happy to discuss that offline or elsewhere. So I'll go over briefly the key results. The first headline result was that this sort of light touch intervention, essentially just telling people that they will be monitored in their performance while executing a high political valence program, it increased implementation quality tremendously. So there was a 3.3% increase in transfers delivered on time, which was obviously the time aspect was critical here because of the use of the money as agricultural inputs, and a 1.5% increase in transfers ever received. These may seem like small percentage numbers, but when you sort of do the math and go down to the actual money, this eventually translates to roughly 25 crore rupees delivered on time and 7 crore rupees ever delivered. So that's what I think when Gaurav meant, that small marginal effects, when you evaluate large programs, small effects also end up mattering a lot. The second key effect was the progressive nature of this sort of intervention. So we see the biggest improvement for the smallest farmers. So small here is by measure of their landowning size. So farmers who owned the least land essentially gained the most from this intervention. And additionally, the program was extremely cost effective. So we estimate our cost at roughly under 4 cents per dollar ever delivered and less than a cent per dollar delivered on time. And this compares extremely favorably to common benchmarks that we use in development economics. So a common one is Progressa, the Progressa cash transfer in Mexico, which costs roughly 9 cents per dollar delivered. This cost to benefit ratio of 4x is really conservative. Is a really conservative estimate of our actual cost value delivered, and we hope that this sort of indicates the potential scope when applied to other similar programs. I can quickly go over sort of some visually indicating these results. So the key message here, this is the aggregate effect across the entire beneficiary population, and here we clearly see that farmers in treatment areas were more likely to get their checks on time. And this essentially, this treatment effect was sustained over the entire cycle of check distribution. And on the next slide, we'll see this effect decomposed by land quartiles. So on the top left, you see the effect for the smallest farmers. And that's really what I meant when I said that we see some sort of progressive effects here, in the sense that farmers with the least land are getting are seeing the most effect in terms of getting their checks on time. And this sort of points to the ability of phone surveys to adjust or mitigate this power dynamic that it might exist at the last mile, which is not visible to policymakers when they design these policies. And I think there's certainly a lot of scope for more research, but we're really excited about the prospects of these policies. I'll hand it back to Gaurav now to go over the Delhi work, and then I'll take it over.
Thanks, Karthik. So I think the first case study was extremely interesting for the fact that it was in a non-COVID era. That was the major difference. And so one other thing I wanted to just talk about briefly was, looking at last mile delivery during the pandemic and some of the efforts that we had with Delhi. So essentially the idea here was, the COVID relief efforts undertaken by the government of Delhi in April and May of last year, after the first COVID lockdown. And so this was at the beginning of the pandemic. And so really there was very little information coming in from ground up in terms of how to handle the pandemic and whether the relief efforts, and there were lots of relief efforts by a lot of state governments as well as the central government. And so whether these relief efforts were really reaching the beneficiaries or not. And so one of the methods that we tried out with the government of Delhi was essentially using beneficiaries from the Mohalla clinics. And so the Mohalla clinics, as probably everyone knows, is this initiative by the Kejriwal government where they had these smaller clinics in smaller localities. And so the good thing was that they used to collect phone numbers for the beneficiaries of these Mohalla clinics. And the beneficiaries were obviously tagged to a Mohalla clinic. So we knew the area in which they lived and so on and so forth. And so what we did was to essentially complete 5,000 calls every week. And so for each district in Delhi, we used to report a weekly dashboard to the state government, wherein the survey, again, used to be probably like a 2 to 3 minute survey on the phone, where we used to contact beneficiaries on loss of earnings, insecurity of food, delivery of PDS benefits, and other COVID relief measures, whether beneficiaries were getting these relief measures or not. And so just to give you a visual of what this used to look like, so this is obviously dummy data. This is not the actual data. But essentially every week, what we used to generate is a dashboard like this, where we used to have the different districts, and we used to have, if you can see my cursor here on the top, we used to have different categories. So whether it's food security, whether it's economic indicators, cash transfers, so on and so forth, and where on average does a district lie. So this was extremely useful, in fact, for the government, just to target some of their relief to certain districts or certain areas where this was a challenge. And so this was what I had talked about as the spatial part of this, right? So where geographically, where does relief need to be targeted? And this was the temporal part of this was the temporal dashboard, right? So because we did the surveys every week, what we could do is really take a timeline across weeks, and we could see how either beneficiary relief or whether it's food security, financial security, earnings, etc., even the stocks and food inflation, right? So we even asked them questions on, whether things are getting expensive to buy in their localities or not. And so for what we could do is, for every district, we could generate a dashboard like this. As you can see here, you could pick out one district, but you also have the distribution across other districts. So not only is it information about your district, it's also information about where others are also relative to your situation at that point in time. And so in a way, I think if I were to summarize what we learned from some of these surveys in the COVID pandemic context in Delhi, one was that it was immensely helpful for the government because it added this ground level visibility at a time when it was completely uncertain what was going on the ground. Second, what was really appreciated from the policy side, as you can imagine, is the high frequency reporting, right? So because we had weekly surveys, and it was eventually after the first couple of weeks where we tried out a bunch of strategies, we actually did get a stable panel of respondents. And so it's essentially what it allowed the government was to really, monitor for the same respondents how things were moving in these districts and over time. And lastly, I think it was a good demonstration for ourselves to convince ourselves that there is actually potential for this high frequency monitoring of using phone surveys to really ramp up data collection quickly and use existing administrative registries in response to the crisis. So for example, it took us only a couple of weeks to set up in terms of accessing the phone numbers from the government of Delhi, designing and piloting the surveys, and actually and starting the phone calls. So it was extremely quick for us to set up some of this, set up these surveys. So I think in the last 10 minutes or so, let me go back to Karthik, who can talk a little bit about. So we have shown some of the case studies on where this worked well, but of course, this is not the golden bullet to solving all our problems. And so in a way, Karthik probably will shed light on, what are some of the limitations that we have to think about when we have this HFM monitoring system. Karthik?
Yeah, thanks, Gaurav. So there's, as Gaurav said, I mean, this is not sort of one size fits all proposition where it's ready for universal adoption across programs. There's certainly modifications and customizations needed, and in certain cases it might not even work at all. And I'm sure there's lots of questions along these lines, and we can get into these in more detail in the Q&A. But the first challenge I want to discuss is representativeness. And so just to go over the history of evaluations of this kind a little bit. So historically, we've had small and representative data sets. And I think anyone who's working in this sector and working in the field, we curate data sets to meet our needs and answer the questions we need. So we ensure representativeness within our samples, target samples. But when we transition from using our own data to administrative data, we get a lot more data. So we get bigger data sets, but then we also get potential non-representativeness. So if you think of this exercise like a funnel, you're essentially at every stage of the funnel, you're worried about potential drop-off. So you're only able to target beneficiaries who have a phone. Then you're only able to actually call people who have a valid phone number. Then you must ensure that the person you're calling has to pick up your call, so et cetera, et cetera. So as you go down this ladder, you realize that you may be systematically excluding people. So this missingness in various forms is potentially correlated with our outcomes of interest. So lack of ownership, inactive phone numbers, lack of participation. So if someone's unavailable to talk, if someone doesn't want to talk, all of these things could be correlated by both our outcome of interest and certain other characteristics that drive the sort of systematic missingness. And the key one that comes to mind is gender, but there's also others like income and social group. And all of these, as tons of research has shown, have deterministic effects on your ability to get benefits from the state. This was seen pretty clearly during the COVID crisis. So as Niharika mentioned early on, I think we saw a spate of studies transition from field to phone surveys for obvious reasons. But we were sort of observing at the same time that as organizations pivoted to phone surveys and remote data collection, there wasn't really the same kind of attention paid to address non-representativeness and missingness as we would have paid when we were in the field. So in the field, we have the ability to track households and make sure we sort of hit our targets. In remote surveys, we're just sort of sitting and hoping that we hit the right population. And we often saw in the COVID situation that this was done without adequate attention to this problem, with potentially really problematic effects. I mean, you can get really misleading interpretation if you're systematically missing out on the most vulnerable sections of the population who happen to not have a phone or not be available to talk to you if they're out working or if they're sort of finding labor, etc., etc. So just quickly going over potential solutions. I mean, this is a really complex topic and there's lots of work here, and happy to engage with anyone offline. And please feel free to sort of send your thoughts. But there's essentially two ways to tackle this. One is sort of improving the quality of the sampling frame. So if you make the funnel broader or better at the first stage, what you end up with is also going to be better. So this could be achieved by triangulating data from multiple admin data sets. So not just restricting to single programs, and also using private providers. So there's recent work by researchers at University of California, Berkeley, who are actually using private call records and sort of cell phone companies to get access to broader data sets. The flip side to this is obviously that you need robust measures of data security. And I mean, you need very strict protocols to prevent misuse, because these are essentially surveys that you're running on behalf of the government. So you want to set railguards such that there's no mission creep. And the other sort of approach to this is statistical inference based. So there's one of our colleagues at PGRP, Sabrish Ramachandran, is actually doing a lot of work on this margin, where he's developing statistical methods that could be used to address these issues, building on past work, obviously, particularly from the election forecasting literature in the US, where they run into this problem a lot because they need to they've had mixed success recently, but in the past, they've used these techniques effectively to predict winners and losers based on cross-cuts of data. And they typically use IPW, which is inverse probability weighting style adjustments and Bayesian modeling, etc. One thing we can do without delving into these sort of high-tech statistical methods is to just capture additional covariates. So if we get more data that may be correlated to both the reason of missingness and the outcomes of interest, such as gender, income, social group, those things tend to really help us reweight our estimates closer to the actual true values. In addition, what could be really helpful is conducting small in-person surveys that could supplement our phone data. So if we don't have any visibility among certain vulnerable populations and we're missing them out completely, then it might help to do certain small surveys such that we can then compare those groups with our represented groups in the phone surveys and make sure that we're not sort of systematically biasing our results. So that's on the representativeness puzzle. There's a few other things, just like caveats or things to keep in mind when applying this to your context. So the another problem with this sort of exercise is that you're unable to distinguish across members within a household. So for cell phones in most of the contexts that we'll work in tend to be shared by multiple household members within the cluster, or sometimes they're also shared across different households in certain villages. So that just makes it impossible to capture any data at a level lower than the household. So you lose out on intra-household dynamics, particularly among women and children. And you also cannot reliably cover sensitive issues like intimate partner violence. There's workarounds and there's really interesting work happening on developing methods to address these problems. But as things stand, like the standard operating process does not allow for this kind of granularity. Next, we see that and this was a question that came up in the chat, and I wasn't able to answer all these questions, but I'll get to them. We need to keep our survey durations really, really short, right? Like, so essentially, we've seen in both the ability of people to give good quality responses, but also their interest overall. You tend to lose a lot once your survey stretches past 5 minutes. And this is particularly important if you're going to call the same beneficiary repeatedly. So if you're constructing a panel of respondents, you want to be really protective of their time. So 5 minutes is really like the sweet spot. Anything more than that doesn't really work. But this means that we're essentially not able to ask questions on topics where we need to go into a lot of detail. So that's sort of a balance that we need to strike. And lastly, there is sort of a question on maintaining our standards of data quality, because when we're in a JPAL IPA style context where we do so much work to prepare our field teams and then essentially set protocols in place to meet our standards for data quality, a lot of that gets immediately thrown out of the window when you don't have visibility on the interaction between the surveyor and the respondent. So there is an argument to essentially develop in-house capacity to rigorously implement these phone surveys, given the tremendous cost-benefit ratio. So we should think a bit more about that. Our team has developed some protocols that we are now sort of getting more and more confident with every sort of iteration of our own implementation. And this involves sort of modifying field protocols to meet the phone world. So some of that could be relying on call recordings or extensive training on certain sort of case studies of certain interactions, things like that. One thing I'd like to point out here is that IVR and SMS may be an answer to this, and someone brought up this in the questions as well. It could circumvent some of these challenges, but in our experience so far, I think it's the technology and right now tends to depend a lot on the beneficiary, on the network strength at the beneficiary level, the cell phone network strength, as well as sort of their response rate, right? Like they're much less likely to respond to an SMS on IVR than they are to a phone survey. So we've faced those challenges a lot, and maybe there's a bit of a way to go to get that sort of set up as an at scale platform, but perhaps there's some potential there as well. So I'm just going to summarize and then hopefully we'll get some time for questions. So over the sort of past 45 minutes or so, we've shown that HFM through phone-based surveys has the potential to deliver tremendous value to both beneficiaries and governments, just simply by generating real-time insights and adding visibility in the implementation of public service programs in the last mile. And that basic fact tends to be missing in a lot of our public service delivery architecture. So just by mitigating those two things, we're able to deliver a lot of value. As admin data get larger in scale and the cost of phone operations reduces further, and accompanied by increased penetration of phones, there is going to be a unique opportunity to incorporate these insights into policy making. So if we can close the loop from collecting data and feeding back into policy, we're going to be able to reap the benefits of this interaction further and further. We've seen that HFM is clearly extremely useful as an additional layer that's added on top of large administrative programs like PDS and the Raitu Bandhu program in our context. But also it is really useful when you're responding to a crisis, and you're responding to a crisis in a low visibility, low data context, such as the COVID pandemic. Any insights are better than no insights. So that simple light touch intervention tends to solve a lot of the first layer of problems that policymakers might face. And just a bit on our work. So we're engaged in conversations and collaborations with CGIS, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, and as well as governments at the state level, some in Delhi, Odisha, Telangana, Jharkhand. And we're obviously open to ideas and potential areas where all of you think there's potential to scale up HFM further. And we're really grateful for the opportunity to present today. And thank you for your time and looking forward to answer questions. And please feel free to reach out to us on these emails. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Karthik and Gaurav, for a really insightful presentation. I think it was great to learn about the concept of HFM and its broad uses, but also see its real-world applications through the case studies. So we do have quite a few questions that came in. Some have been answered by Karthik already, but we'll take the others live. So how did we take into consideration the burden which is being placed on the beneficiaries for spending time on calls while doing HFM? This is the first question by Aditi Gupta.
Yeah, so I was alluding to this a little bit in the last section. Yeah. I think we want to be really protective of beneficiary time, and I think that's why sort of reducing the survey length drastically. I mean, 5 minutes is a pretty short duration. I mean, I think most of us who have done surveys in the field are used to sort of surveys 10 or 20 times as long as that. So I think 5 minutes is a good sort of start. And I think the disciplining device here is to go back to your reports and make sure that you only collect data on indicators that you're directly using to either inform policy, in the sense that you're including indicators that are on report cards that are being shared with the bureaucrats, or you're using it in your evaluation such that they're important for your sort of, if you're doing an RCT, they are using it in some way. So I think that is really that is an exercise that you should do to discipline yourself. but and repeatedly, most importantly, if you're doing repeat calls with a panel, then you really want to cut down on survey duration.
Yeah, and I think this relates also, if I could just quickly jump in, also the second question I think which came on, which is how do we get consent if it's a 5-minute call? I think that's a great question. And I think the way that we have been thinking about, and that ties into what Karthik is saying with respect to taking into consideration. So I think in most of these, the aim is pretty clear. And I think HFM in a way, as a researcher, I think it's a very good disciplining device, because what we have time for essentially, as Karthik was saying, is to ask these 5 or 7 very important questions that are going to tie directly into policy making or tie directly into whatever you're trying to study. And so in a way, consent becomes much easier because there are only, say, for example, if it's ration cards, I need to only ask consent about the fact that, look, like this is a program that's been implemented. Would you be happy giving us feedback on this program? And that's pretty much, a good way to start this conversation. And so in a way, the consent, along with the fact that, it's a very short survey, I think is really where, it comes together in terms of not putting too much of a burden on their time, as well as, making sure we are not, making sure beneficiaries are comfortable with giving their consent and sharing information with us.
Right. Thanks, Karthik. Thanks, Gaurav. So I think the next question is also a little bit of an operational question in terms of access to data. So how is the data security problem overcome while getting the personal details of respondents?
Yeah, so I mean, data security, so there are two parts to this, right? So one is the administrative data security. So when we get the phone numbers from, say, the state government, for example, so it's always on their servers in a way. So, it's identifiable data is never taken off the government servers, for example. And so in a way, when it's shared from the government side, it's secure. And then the data that we collect is, I mean, JPAL has very strict and standard protocols on, maintaining data security, because obviously it's a big issue. And so in a way that, for example, like you could share it, you could have it on secure servers within JPAL itself, or you could have, these cold computers and so on and so forth. So we could get in the details of data security itself. But it is ensured that to the extent possible on the frontier, we try to maintain data security in terms of, making sure it's stored well with either JPAL or the government.
Right. Thanks so much, Gaurav. So I think the next question is a little bit about how we analyze and interpret the data. So for an RCT, we face a lot of threats, such as social interaction threats, random dropouts. And in such cases, how do you interpret the data that is received? And this might be a larger RCT question. And maybe it's even more challenging when you're doing phone surveys. So, yeah.
I can talk.
Yeah, Karthik. Yeah.
I can talk a little bit about the Telangana RPS experience on this context. I think in that setting, what really helped us was the fact that we had administrative data on the universe of beneficiaries. So we had phone data for the 22,000 people in our sample, but we were able to sort of get administrative data on transactions, like so whether or not you received a check and whether or not you encashed a check on the universe of beneficiaries. So we were able to look at the population. I think that is fairly hard to replicate in other contexts. You may not see the universe of beneficiaries in other programs, but doing certain, I mean, I'm guessing that this description is getting at the problem of low visibility in a phone setting. So anything you can do to augment that would help. So I think a typical case would be to get transactions data for, let's say, PDS. So if you're speaking to a sample of 10,000 people, you maybe want to make the case to the government that please share the transactions data for these 10,000 people, so we can then corroborate their self-reported experience with the experience that you have recorded in your servers. So those kinds of conversations help. So any sort of more data from the admin side you can get to sort of place these things in conversation. And then on the dropouts question, I think, I mean, you have those concerns. You need to, so your data is only as good as your ability to sort of get data out of people. And so that rests a lot on operator quality, training the surveyors, etc., and designing instruments such that you don't place a burden on people, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. The quality of admin data in both being able to access as many beneficiaries as possible, but also being able to triangulate is really important. So I think the next question is about applicability of phone surveys. We talked a lot about the different applications, but we also know that it doesn't work in all contexts. So what do you think about the applicability of phone-based surveys to test early literacy and numeracy learning outcomes of students? Yeah, this is submitted by someone who's anonymous.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, Karthik, feel free to jump in at any point, but some things are just hard to do over the phone. Like, I mean, you can't, if it's a 5-minute survey and you want to credibly test, for example, like the other thing that we were thinking about just the other day, I mean, education is one, but health is another one, right? So if you want to measure anthropometric data, or if you want to measure height or weight or something, obviously some things you can't do over the phone. So similarly, I guess, like if it's basic literacy or numeracy, I guess you could devise some way in which you could test it over the phone. But I think it's important to also appreciate that this is not the golden blanket for measuring everything that you can over the phone. But there could be ways of doing that. I mean, one other example is what we have been trying with some online job portals is essentially sending them out online forms to fill out. I mean, that's another way in which we've been trying. I mean, obviously, there comes a lot of other things and limitations with that. But if you could take surveys or through say a tablet or through other technologies, that might be one improvement to capture some of these other data. But if it's a simple phone survey, I doubt it's going to be very easy to do that for some of these questions.
Yeah, just a on that, I think we've seen, I think we know of at least one study and that one of the people we mentioned are essentially running or were running during the first lockdown on sort of remote learning when schools shut down and states pivoted to remote learning, essentially just measuring access, right? Like, so did the intended beneficiary get the tablet, or did they receive the modules, and how long, what is the self-reported learning on those modules? So that kind of stuff you can do. There's also examples during the COVID, sort of in the COVID context of measuring losses in learning. So we've seen that internationally as well. And there's a lot of work in the World Bank that looked at those questions. But again, like Gaurav said, a lot of that has to rely on self-reported measures. And we've other work has documented how poorly self-reported health and education measures line up with actual data. So you worry about that. So I think if you give people tablets, then you get their responses on the tablets, and you're able to test children on tests given out on tablets. But outside of those sort of online solutions, just on phone surveys, this is a hard problem to tackle.
Right, yeah. And the next question, I think, is a little bit of a technical one. So Apurva Tiwari is wondering, what are the different ways to capture covariates related to dropouts and non-response?
So I think dropouts is easier because at least you have a survey where you can ask them some of this information if you think that certain types of people are more likely to drop out. Non-response is the harder one, right? Because if you don't have a response, you don't know anything about the respondent in a way. And so it's difficult to capture covariates. So I think what we have been relying on is basically the quality of administrative data. So in a way, like if you look at ration cards, for example, in the PDS example, you have the ration card in itself gives you a lot of covariate information about the household. So you could use that information to then predict which types of households are less likely to answer phone calls. And so in other contexts, you might have, so basically non-response, I think, will be limited to how rich your administrative data is to be able to give you something about the covariates to try and understand which groups are less likely to respond to your surveys. For dropouts, I think you could, if it's in the initial part, as is with standard surveying, in the initial part, you could ask a couple of questions regarding the characteristics of the individual or the household. And so dropouts, that way, I think you could capture some of the covariates.
Yeah, awesome. And just to complement that, I think one quick thing that we could, I mean, we haven't done it yet ourselves, but we think there's potential here on non-response is to pilot really, really small, short field visits. So if you're able to, if you know who your non-respondents are and you know who your respondents are, you can do quick sort of field visits to track down your non-respondents and then see if they differ systematically from your respondents. And that's just mostly an accounting exercise. I mean, it's equivalent of like running a balance test on treatment and control, something like that, right? So those kinds of things could help because this is like still 2% of your overall, what would have been a field survey costing like $200,000 would maybe cost like $10,000 in this context, but it could help convince your target audience that you're actually getting at representativeness. So yeah, there's some potential there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Karthik and Gaurav. I hope that was useful. So I think another question here, two questions actually. So what were some of the best times of the day and week to make these calls? And did you avoid weekends? And the other question is, in case of phone calls, how do we take care of data cleaning as we may get random answers? And for the first question, if you'd like to share any other examples of how you sort of adapted to phone surveys, please feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, so I think the first question is, again, very important from running these surveys. So one is, we did not avoid weekends. In fact, weekends were the time when people are free at home and can answer your phone calls. So in a way, weekends are the time to run these phone surveys. But it's all about developing protocols at some point. So for example, for one of the studies that we had done, we had a protocol of contacting people 3 or 4 times. If people cannot make it now, you politely can ask them for if there is another time that would work for them. To call them back again, so on and so forth. Or if there is no response, we can still try calling them 3 or 4 times just to make sure whether this is about the non-response or whether this is about people, just not the right time to contact you, even though you might be willing to take our surveys. So I think it's all about like piloting and like figuring out what is the appropriate protocol for that particular set of people who you want to survey. And then data cleaning, I think, yes, you get some random answers, but usually if it's a structured survey in terms of multiple choices and you don't leave a lot of open end, because if it's 5 minutes, and that's what I said in the beginning as well, I guess it forces a researcher to be very disciplined in terms of what data you have to collect. And so in a way, if you can structure a survey such that you limit the open-endedness of answers, then in that case, data cleaning becomes much simpler because the randomness of these answers really goes down.
Yeah. Karthik, anything to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, just as Gaurav said, the protocol varies by context. In the Telangana case, we learned very quickly that you can't really talk to farmers in like early mornings because they're busy. So you have to sort of wait till the afternoon, and also late nights are not feasible either. But in the Delhi case, we realized that you might want to call them early morning or over the weekends, as Gaurav said. So the protocol, you'll have to do a lot of piloting. I think that's always a good idea. I mean, we do that in the field context. We should do it in the phone context. And that helps both with disciplining your protocols and also sort of making your survey as objective and as straightforward as possible. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Karthik and Gaurav. I think that's a good place to stop since we're almost out of time. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your active participation and engaging with the speakers. Of course, if you're interested in continuing the conversation, please email them on their email IDs. And we also invite you to share your own experiences and learnings from phone surveys and discuss different applications of phone surveys in your work. So we'll be reaching out to you with all with a recording of the webinar and some additional materials and key takeaways in a few days. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks again, Karthik and Gaurav.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.